everybody. Welcome to Original Thinkers Online and the Original Thinkers Show, the Original Thinkers Podcast. I don't really know what it is, but what we're trying to do here at Original Thinkers is reinvent ourselves. The festival's in October. This is springtime, and what we decided to do was that we think original thinking is needed now more than ever. We don't know if we'll be able to do a regular festival. It certainly won't be regular. We don't know if we'll be able to do a full festival, but we do know that the people who've been through our festival, the people who are going to be in our festival, has so much to say about this crazy new world we're living in. And so what we did was we reached out to a bunch of folks and said, hey, would you come talk to us and say, give us your perspective, not only on what's happening in their world, but also what's happening, what's going to happen. We need original thinking here. And so the idea is what does that look like? And so I couldn't be happier to be joined by Jane Ferguson, who's in Beirut, Lebanon. Hi, Jane.
Hi, how you doing?
It's great to see you.
Good to see you too. I wish I was in Telluride instead, though. Much as I love Beirut.
It was so much fun having you here. And as those of you at the festival remember, and those who weren't should know, Jane was one of our star guests of our first festival, 2018. And Jane is a war correspondent. She and I met in Afghanistan years and years ago. And she has continued this work with PBS, with Al Jazeera, with a bunch of different outlets, and goes into some of the most dangerous places imaginable to report the stories that a lot of people can't tell. And she had a huge year last year, winning all sorts of awards, including, all right, I got to do it, Jane, just point out your Emmy up there in the corner. She won an Emmy for her coverage of the Emmy. She tried to hide it, but it's there. I see it. But what she did was extraordinary, and what she brought to the Original Thinker stage was remarkable. And so first of all, thank you for doing this, Jane. It really is nice to see you. And tell us, first of all, what are things like in Beirut?
Well, thanks for having me on. It's just great to be able to see another face and talk, because things here have been on lockdown for what feels like about 15 months. But in reality, it's been about 6 weeks. February 28th, they started shutting schools and colleges, and within about 2 weeks, they had shut all bars and restaurants and cafes, which in this Mediterranean party town is pretty significant lifestyle change. And people here have always kind of remarked about how even during the worst of the civil war, or wars with Israel and various conflicts that have broken out here, the bars have never shut and the cafes and restaurants have gone on. But everything now is very, very different. So it's been very eerie. We've had a curfew brought in a few weeks ago to sort of really reinforce the lockdown, and that meant like the military coming out and sort of making sure people were staying in their homes. But at the same time, it hasn't been panicked. People are pretty much following their instincts and being pretty sensible. I mean, cultures like this know how to survive a crisis in a really sort of savvy, community-focused way. So it's just, thankfully, we're just bored, which I think is a luxury at the moment.
And tell me about the medical situation. How severe are cases there?
Right now, I mean, they're aware they're not testing enough, but of the testing that they've done, they've got just under 700 cases. And I believe the fatalities so far are about 20. So one of the reasons that the government brought in such incredibly strict, very, very early measures to lock down was because they know that they will never be able to cope with a spike. Like, they had no choice but to flatten the curve, because the country went bankrupt just a couple of weeks before this all started, and like the government literally went bankrupt. And so they are very well aware that they're not well equipped. They've got great doctors and great hospitals, but they can't cope. Like, a lot of these are private facilities, so the state institutions for health care are just not kitted out for this kind of pandemic. So they knew that. So there's sort of a relief at the moment that they managed to get ahead of it.
It sounds ahead of it and ahead of the United States in some ways.
A bit. I mean, there are American citizens here who decided not to go to the States. Some of the flights were offered for expatriates to go back to places like the UK and the United States, and many people didn't get on those flights because things here seem to be fairly under control.
Talk to me about the rest of the region. I mean, is Lebanon an outlier, or tell me, because I know you've looked into COVID around the Middle East.
Lebanon, it's fair to say that Lebanon is something of an outlier in the sense of getting ahead of it pretty well. Jordan, we all joked in the early days of our lockdown. We said, things could be worse. We could be living in Jordan, where the government brought in the most strict lockdown at the time, the strictest in the world outside of China, where they were very well aware of the same thing. This is another country with a huge refugee population, Palestinians and, of course, many, many Syrians. And so they jumped on this really fast, and they actually locked people in their homes for several days and told them they couldn't even go out to buy groceries. Eventually, they lifted that because obviously it caused quite a bit of panic. But so a few countries have been getting ahead of it. But then, there's also this issue in places like Iraq and Egypt, where you've got governments that are trying to basically squash any press on the numbers. They've been kicking journalists out of the country whenever they try to report on the fact that the number of cases is likely much higher than the official numbers. So there's a murkiness to how badly other countries like Iraq and Egypt have it. We know, of course, that the situation in Iran is and has been absolutely dire, and in places like Yemen, where we don't believe there's very much testing possible at all, they've had their first case, the first positive case that's been tested, come through, and that's causing a bit of panic, of course. Also in Israel, there's been a very, very big outbreak, but again, a very strong government response to that, where the government has had to come in and quarantine people very strictly, and they have taken a different approach in the sense that they're doing mass testing now in Israel. They've been piloting a scheme for drive-through testing, which does seem to be working. So, things here are bad, but in terms of the death tolls, we're not seeing the kind of numbers that we're watching and seeing in Europe. Instead, there's just been largely a very, very big push for people to quarantine, because they know that if the British NHS and the American medical system can't cope with this, then governments here don't stand a chance.
Let's move on to Syria, where you've spent a lot of time and been in and out of. What's happening there? Do you have a sense of that in terms of COVID, real quick?
In terms of COVID?
Yes.
Well, the Syrian government says, and it could be true, they say that they have very few cases. This is a regime that's now isolated, very much so isolated from the rest of the world diplomatically as a result of the atrocities committed during the war. So that might ironically save it to a certain extent, but it's unlikely that they don't have outbreaks, because whenever you consider the close relationships between the Iranians and the Syrian regime and movement of people in and out, a big source of anxiety for several weeks now, maybe even months, I suppose, since this all really started to explode, is the northeast of Syria, up in Idlib province, where you've got several million people displaced, crammed into a top corner of the country, pushed up against the Turkish border, which is shut to them, living in camps that humanitarian agencies describe as a disaster zone for disease outbreaks. It's impossible to tell how many cases of COVID-19 there are there, and whether or not that's spreading around. We know that there have been suspected cases, but we just don't know. And the problem is that a lot of these places are big black spots for people. And I think it'll be several weeks before we get any idea as to how severe the outbreaks are.
Jane, what happens to conflict in a time of pandemic? I mean, wars are happening. We have strife in Afghanistan, of course, Syria, Yemen, so many places. I read in the United States, and this is related but different, that March was the first month without a school shooting in this country in a long time, because, of course, kids weren't in school. And I think so many things that are traumatic, that are real and painful, have taken a hiatus. As the Taliban?
It is fascinating watching the psychology of the value of human life. The Taliban they've actually been doing these huge outreach projects, like media outreach as well, where they're trying to showcase how seriously they take this. In fact, I've been working remotely through some colleagues in Afghanistan on a piece about this, with the Taliban forcibly quarantining people, especially those like Afghans who come back from Iran. Many of them work work in Iran and then return. And what's clear to me is that this group is very keen to be seen to be doing something, and that's really the key across conflicts that we all cover, whether those are in places like Gaza or Yemen. There's a PR element to dealing with a pandemic, and I know I sound cynical, but you can't help but be cynical with a group like the Taliban, who shows such disregard for civilian life in their suicide bombing campaigns, that they're now, trying to warn people to quarantine them, to make sure that there's enough ambulances in rural areas. It's really surreal to watch and hear them talking about public health. Same thing in Yemen. Both sides technically made noises about having a ceasefire. Initially, it was the Saudi coalition that said it was going to hold a ceasefire. I mean, this is a coalition that has been accused of widespread crimes, war crimes, of bombing schools and hospitals. Like, literally, I've been in hospitals that they've bombed. So it's just fascinating that you're watching combatants in war zones saying, at least making noises about reacting to a pandemic, as though human life is less inherently valuable in a field of war, as opposed to whenever there's been a disease outbreak.
That's so heavy. The idea of saying that, hey, we're happy to set up our IDs, we're happy to shell and mortar innocent people, but now that this is pandemic, we want to save them. I mean,
and the irony is that wars so often lead to disease outbreaks anyway. You know that. Like, I mean, in places like Haiti. Yemen, and Haiti, of course, cholera in Haiti, and now the biggest cholera outbreak in Yemen. If you destroyed people's ability to have clean running water because of conflict, it's, diseases always kill more people. Well, often kill more people than combat does. When you can't develop medical facilities and medical systems in countries. So, I'm sure there's a lot of doctors scratching their heads in Yemen right now, wondering why everyone's terrified of COVID-19 whenever kids are dying of diphtheria.
Wow, yeah, there's so many layers to that, and I think in terms of, it's not a peace, but there is a pause, right? It's not like everybody's like, oh, we get along now, but they're going to say, hey, we're just going to press pause on a lot of wartime activity.
Yeah, there's at least this sort of interesting acknowledgement that there should be a pause, even if they don't quite know how to go about it. Like, everybody feels like someone sort of rang a bell. And I don't know if it's instinctive or if it's tactical, because if you think about it, if there's one group that can never socially isolate, it's soldiers. Armies can't, crammed into tanks and crammed into military bases. It's just not possible.
Bunkers and barracks and Well, and so we've had a big thing here with the USS Roosevelt, the naval ship where there was a giant outbreak, and but that it's almost self-protection.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's like, as someone who covers conflict and is constantly confronted with the reality that some human life is clearly viewed as more valuable than other human life, whether it's, a Pakistani civilian versus an American soldier, or it's a Yemeni child versus a Saudi soldier. Civilian life is of varying degrees of importance to varying people in the world. And what's fascinating is watching the debates going on in the United States right now, about reopening economies, about whether or not, there's almost sort of a sort of shyness to talking about some talking points which people are aware are taboo, and they're quite dark. about how old people are dying anyway of certain illnesses and whether or not they should, it's strange and dark and frightening to watch people assess what human life is worth protecting and what is not. And I find that a fascinating parallel to wars.
So you're not a public health expert or epidemiologist, but we talk about original thinking a lot in this festival, in this organization. And what do you hope, the silver lining, what do you hope comes out of this? I mean, we have this pause on war that could go on for quite a long time. Do you see things happening that give you hope in the face of this, or the scope of this pandemic?
There are some things that give me hope, and it's certainly not my original idea, but it's been a talking point for some time now that solutions to conflict can only really be found at a local level, in terms of people finding within their own communities a resolution to conflict. And you do see communities like societies. People say this is a great leveler, this disease, and it's not really. Some people can shelter in space in place on a yacht, and some people have to go to work and stack shelves, and so it's not really a leveler, I think, of all people. But what's interesting is watching it be a leveler of countries, because it's not so much about your economic wealth of the country, but about the cultures. And there are certain cultures that are rising up and I believe are really showing their strengths, like here in the Mediterranean cultures, where communities are really looking out for one another. There isn't this sense that, old people can, they're going to die anyway. Instead, old people still live in the homes with their families. These are Mediterranean families, and grandma lives in the house, and everybody has a role to play. And I see communities, I think that the hope is that communities, the sort of green shoot would be if communities that are at war are able to draw on their strengths of their resilience and their sort of local grassroots ability to care for one another in a way that we don't always see in certain wealthier countries where individualism reigns a little bit more. You don't see anybody stockpiling toilet roll in these countries, and there's a reason for that. And that's where I have hope, because that doesn't need money. That just needs people. That just needs people to be left in peace, to be able to sort of develop their own community connections and pull themselves out of these crises.
Yeah, I've had some friends. Somebody referred to it as the after. What happens in the after? That was its own thing, and I thought that was super interesting. And another friend texted me, said that he and his wife were talking about how, as awful as this was, they didn't want to go back to where they were before. And these are pretty successful LA media executives who are saying they've found a new gear, a new speed, a new connection, and I think there's power in that. The flip side is Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump, all these people have said, Xi and all, Putin, all have said, there's an opportunity to grab power. Yeah. And it's almost, you've got the grassroots, then you've got where do you think that'll end up?
I think one of the good things is that one of the positive strengths is to show that about this crisis is that none of those people caused this. Like we can't blame COVID-19 on anybody. We can't blame it on Islamist terrorists or
Chinese virus,
or even the Chinese. There's an attempt to cast blame, but nobody can. So what's so fascinating about this, as opposed to a post after a war or after a terror attack, there's no way to sort of cast blame and harbor ill will. So I think that gives us a little bit of distance to be able to watch those who are trying to manipulate the situation for their own personal gain. I think it's just easier to see because there's no common enemy that we're all going to turn against, other than a virus, which is just, none of us can see it. So I think that whenever you do see deeply cynical moves. These are, I think, something that I don't think will be successful, because I don't think human fear is as easily manipulated whenever it's not an enemy that we can see. I think that the states that have been encroaching on their own people's freedoms, especially places like Turkey, I honestly think, perhaps it sounds cynical, but I think that those power grabs would have happened anyway. I think that, there's a sense of momentum around the world right now where there is almost like a galloping pace of the populism, of the push to throw away hard-fought freedoms and rights, the push to control and grab power. There's almost like a fatalism to it. And I think that COVID is a tool used by anybody wanting to grab power, but I honestly think they would have used it anyway. They would have found something else to use it. And I think that, I don't know. I'm not sure that this situation is as easily manipulated by dictators as it would be if it was something like a war or a terror attack. I think this is almost too scary for them.
Yeah, my theory is that in this pandemic situation, good people are going to be better, bad people are going to be worse. That, wherever we were before this, we're just going to be that, except more.
Yeah.
If you're anxious, you're going to be more anxious. If you're like, okay, I've got life, you're going to be like, I got this, and I think that to me has that's my theory, whether that's true or not.
I do think crises have a tendency to do that. I mean, they also kind of mirror the world back at itself.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think that's right. Let me ask you about you. You're a conflict reporter, and it's not a conflict, but this is the biggest thing, and it's really hard to cover. How do you go about that? What's that like for you?
I feel like I'm barely covering it. I'm a field reporter. I'm not an anchor or a studio person. I don't even do in-house packaging, as we call it in the industry, where you'll just sort of put together a piece using agency picture. Like what I do is I go to a place and I talk to people and I build a report around it. And I have found it unbelievably difficult. I mean, I have paced the carpet threadbare in my apartment, walking up and down and trying to strategize how to get here, and could I get a visa even though the embassy's shut, and then could I get on an airplane? And occasionally I go through phases of acceptance that I'm stuck, and then there are other times when I'm in such deep denial that I'm strategizing with my poor husband about how maybe I could get a ferry to Cyprus, and then out into the outer world. And I've never spent this amount of time in one country since maybe I was, 26 or 27.
You said you've never spent a month in one place.
2 months.
2 months.
This is like 2 months, and that's a record. So it's hard, it's very hard. And I was talking to other journalists that work around the region as well. None of us are used to dealing with the kind of ethical questions we're faced with now. We're used to putting ourselves in danger fairly regularly, not recklessly and not for a thrill, but like we take measured, considered risks all the time. We'll go, but we always think that those risks are to ourselves. I always think like, what am I risking? And it's me and my team, which is usually a really small team, like a camera person and one other producer maybe. And so we think of physical risk to ourselves, but then like the implications of going out and reporting on this, visiting a hospital and then returning, if you can fly to Kabul, that's all well and good, but what if you travel out into rural areas of Afghanistan and then bring the disease back with you? It's just having to think, where I'm used to being so in charge of my own life and my own work. I'm used to being so autonomous, and now it's very, very difficult to have to sit here and not.
And I think the other thing with you Sorry to interrupt. One of the other things with you is it's not just like you have to be up, but you have to understand and take on other people's suffering. You have to broadcast that to the world and know that how hard is it for you to know that all these people out there are suffering and you're not able to tell their story.
Yeah, and how authentic can a report be when you're not there? I tried here in Lebanon, I did go out and do one day of reporting where I went out and trailed, I basically followed the Red Cross ambulances that bring people from their homes to the hospital who have suspected COVID-19. And I went to this one apartment building, and the Red Cross had made me and my cameraman promise we would stay in the car, parked across the road as they brought the guy out of his apartment building, put him in the ambulance, and then we sort of pushed them a little, and they let us get out of the car and film just sort of standing by the bonnet. And then this man's elderly mother came out, and she came out and stood in the street, and she was completely alone, weeping and terrified and really shell-shocked. And so I naturally gravitate towards her and walk across the street. My cameraman follows me, and she starts to walk towards me, and I try to yell a few questions from several meters away, but she walks towards me. And this is an elderly woman who's really got nobody, like no one comes down into the street. I mean, people are afraid of the disease. And so she's standing alone in the street. And in what was like the most inhumane, counterintuitive moment of my career, like I had to back away from her. You know, like I walked backwards and I waved to say goodbye and jumped in the car. And like this old lady just needed someone to put an arm around her and say, you know, he'll be all right, you know. And it's absolutely awful. It's so counterintuitive not to show some empathy and kindness and decency towards people in a way that is just normal human behavior. So like that's been my only one-on-one reporting, and it felt very, very uncomfortable.
So you have your husband, you have your cats, you have some wine, you have some books, you have some DVDs. You know, you told me the other day that you've got some friends out and about that you can kind of so safely gather with. But how are you processing all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was pretty good at the start because I treated it like this sort of fascinating project. I bought a treadmill, panic bought a treadmill, which has been a mental health tool like no other. So I'm trying to run off all of the pasta and wine every day, and I just get on the treadmill, and of course I'm the irony of running to nowhere is not lost on me as I stare at the horizon and run out the window of my dining room. It's hard. It's very hard to not fill your day with projects and try to be productive. It's very hard to allow yourself to be still, because whenever you're a foreign correspondent, I mean, we get to hide our own personal restlessness behind busy travel, work. I mean, we've made it a career. We've made it look really we've made it look very respectable, the fact that we can't stay still and need the newness and freshness and of going on an airplane to a different country all the time. So, you know, being forced to sit in a room with yourself is not as easy as I thought it would be. And I definitely now know that I don't think I could ever do any serious prison time. So
that's good things to know about yourself. I think we'll call this episode of the Original Thinker Show Running to Nowhere with Jane Ferguson. Jane, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for talking to us. I know you're in a weird limbo space of, you know, moving from here to there, but you know, you're not a national treasure, you're an international treasure. It's important, the work that you do. We're super grateful for you, and I'm really honored that you've taken the time. I know you've got lots of time right now, but thank you for spending it with us and for your insight, and we'll come back to you, you know, and really want you back to the festival and all of that. But please stay safe, and thank you so much.
Likewise, I hope you do too. Thank you for joining me on my wild Friday night here in Beirut. So
it is, that's right. It's Friday night gone crazy. Well, look, Be good. Say hi to Matt, and keep us posted what you're up to. And we'll be posting stuff when you're reporting and making sure that our audience can see it as well. So take good care.
Thank you.